everybody. Welcome to the 18th Annual Community Lecture Series. None of us can believe that it's been 18 years since we started this. As usual, Ann Boone, who was one of the birthing mothers of this series, is not here, but Kitty Robbins is here. The two of them took a fateful walk 18 or 19 years ago and decided we should have this series. Kitty, would you stand up and let's all give you a round of applause. And we'll say hello to Ann too when she comes back from Southern Climes or wherever she is. So I'm doing my usual thing for this series, but it's a little bit of a different thing this evening because I want to just make my bookkeeping, my logistic kind of remarks, and then I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague Ashby Kinch from the English department, who will introduce you to the whole series for this year and also introduce our lecturer for this evening. So mine is mostly technical stuff for this evening, beyond the welcome. First, I want to remind you, if you haven't yet turned off your cell phones, to do that. Second, I want to thank MCAT for taping all of these lectures as usual. And as we get later on in the series, I'll be able to give you the schedule for when those are going to be broadcast on MCAT. I believe I heard earlier on today that we have some DVDs from last year's series available. I don't know how many are available, but I think if you see Angela at the end of this evening, she can let you know. She's right over here. She can let you know how much they cost and how you can acquire one from her. So there were some people who were interested in that. I'm really excited to introduce this series tonight because these are colleagues from actually my division of the university, the humanities and the arts. And we have representatives from history, English, theater and dance, philosophy, and modern classical languages and literatures on our docket for this year. So I hope you'll all enjoy this series, which is going to be maybe a little bit different from other ones that we've had. And as usual, we'll be getting together on the very last evening after the lecture to celebrate the end of the series and to meet with all of the lecturers who can be there with us. As is our usual custom, we are going to make quick introductions this evening and then get right on to Anya's lecture. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, Ashby Kinch, who is a professor of English and does ancient late medieval art and literature, which is kind of interesting for me because any medievalist worth his salt has to know Latin at least. Ashby and I have both have acquired a commonality there. So I think I'm just going to turn it over to Ashby so that we can move right along. Ashby?
Everyone can hear me in the back and everything. Don't have to shout too loud. I'd like to thank Ann and Kitty and the Community Lecture Series Committee and Chris Comer for asking me and Anya to organize this series back in September. They got in touch with us and said they wanted to do something in the humanities. And Anya and I had a couple of long power lunches at Buttercup and brainstormed how we might approach it. And we decided to go with people. We started to start with people. People on campus who inspire us and interest us. Of course, my first move was to crab out of responsibility for giving a full lecture. There's so many incredible humanist scholars on this campus. I couldn't imagine myself talking when I knew I wanted to hear from so many of them, and I include Anya in that. She wanted to crab out as well, but I wouldn't let her. But I'm quite excited that we were able to convince so many of our colleagues to be involved. But the committee thought, after we started with the people approach rather than the theme approach, it's a little different than we've done in past years. We're not talking about birds or water or the brain or Russia. We're talking in this broad sense about the humanities. So they thought it would be a good idea for me to just talk a little bit about kind of what unifies and brings this group of people together and talk about the humanities in a kind of more general sense. Now, that date, September, is an important one because, of course, since then, we've had a few bad news events in our community. I'm sure you guys have read the articles and been paying attention. This community of people is particularly locked on to the university and how important it is. And I have to say that in the intervening months, you can view this as a glass half full, glass half empty situation. I've received letters, notes from people in the community, former students. It's been a very inspiring time in a weird way, because these notes continually say, hey, what you do is important. We really appreciate it. We really value it. Some people in this room know Hal Braun. I got a great note from him. He's a former student of mine. I taught in the Mali program. Is he here tonight? Hal? A lot of you know Hal. And so that's why we do this. I mean, that's, whether it be impacting our students in the classroom, or trying to reach a broader audience with our ideas, or reach into our community and share our knowledge and learn from our community. That's why we do the research that we do. So very, very glad that you're here with us tonight, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about this series as a whole. Because we have such a broad range of speakers, we had to think quite a bit about, what are the humanities, what do they really mean? And so being an English professor, I thought a lot about just the word itself, and I did a little philology. How many of you know that word philology? Good, great. This is great to hear. You don't hear that a lot, but back in the 19th century, in my discipline, medieval studies, philology meant something. It's a very powerful, strong word. And by the middle of the century, that term had been kind of crowded out of scholarly study, largely by linguists who came along and said, well, that's kind of amateurish, broad study of literature. We do language study. That's what's really hard and serious and discipline specific. So the word philology kind of fell off the shoals. And humanities as a term kind of has an interesting history as well, I've discovered in doing some of this digging. The word humanities, when applied to discipline study in a university setting, has a kind of strange history, and it illuminates how mushy the category really is. H.W. Fowler, in his 1926 Dictionary of Modern English Usage, writes that the humanities, or citing the Latin, literae humaniores, my Latinist colleague will know why that's a kind of strange locution, are but an old-fashioned name for the study of classical literature. Mind you, that's 1926. This begs the question, how old-fashioned? In English, we find uses as early as 1476, where it refers, and here I'm going to give you some Middle English pronunciation, double science, that is to say, divinité and humanité. That comes from Caxton's 1476 translation of the Golden Legend. In the 16th century, the word humanity in the singular typically referred to the study of classical literature and was generally opposed to the study of sacred or divine letters, which is to say theology. Indeed, Francis Bacon's 1605, The Advancement and Proficiency of Learning, Divine and Human, describes what he calls three knowledges: divine philosophy, natural philosophy, and humane philosophy, or humanity, in the singular. So within the university, the term referred to the specific study of classical literature and philosophy in Greek and Latin, but it had also taken on a broader meaning of a general study of human life, as in Harrington's Brief Apology for Poetry in the 1590s, in which he says, "If then we may spend some of our young years in study of humanity, what better and more meet study is there for a young man than poetry?" As new disciplines sprung up in the university, the term broadens further and begins this awkward process of sorting itself out as a catch-all term for whatever is not studied in a particular specific way in some other place. An American commentator in 1855 extols the fact that, quote, "For the first time in the history of our American universities, there has been a formal academic recognition of music as legitimately one of the humanities." Of course, this is kind of interesting now to think about it now, because of course now music is its own school and its own discipline as part of the finer performing arts, and that secondary distinction sprung up later, despite the fact that music in the original liberal arts curriculum was one of a core subject. It was part of the quadrivium. I'll talk a little bit about that later. In 1918, we read in the Journal of Geography that the problems of geography are human problems, for geography is a humanity as it is a science. It is one of the human sciences. That latter term won the battle for the heart of geography, right? So no geographer today would say, I'm a humanist. They do social science or human science. The college in which 5 of the 6 participants in the series teach is now known as the College of Humanities and Sciences, a rebranding necessary in a world in which the old name, Arts and Sciences, no longer means what it once meant. Inside the academy, the word arts has always connoted liberal arts, a very specific curricular designation that goes back centuries to Roman and medieval universities, who had a trivium made up of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and a quadrivium made up of music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. You'll note there's no humanity in this, as the activities so described were either threaded into all of the other activities, especially in the trivium, right? That is, if you're going to do humanities back then, you did it in grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Or they were considered to be things that one did on one's own time, not necessary to a curriculum. So now we have a humanities in the modern university that might best be described by what it is not. Not science, not art, fine, or performing, not social science, not a profession, not applied. This potted history of a word illustrates why Anya and I and others have had such a hard time. Ginny and McNulty and I were just emailing about this today, composing a mission statement for the proposed UM's Humanities Institute, which that's what we're calling it right now. The statement, which we hope will be in front of the Board of Regents later this year, includes this one-sentence definition. Drawing on a rich tradition of scholarship in the humanities that reflects over a century of commitment to the goal, the Humanities Institute seeks to advance the scholarly work of faculty and students who desire to explore, illuminate, and expand human self-understanding. Explore, illuminate, and expand human self-understanding. I like that. That feels good to me. But it's not very precise, right? And it opens up a lot of doors to a lot of fields beyond what we might call traditional humanities. So when the lecturers for this year's series met to discuss, what we might title the series, given the heterogeneity of our research topics, we contemplated what it was that unified work in the humanities, what made it a common enterprise among a variety of fields. We kept circling back to the importance of the human at the core of the word, and that key idea of self-understanding. The unique characteristics of the humanities is its emphasis on studying humans not just from the outside, how our bodies function, how we operate in the world, from which we learn all kinds of great things from biology, chemistry, anthropology, and a range of other disciplines, but how they look from the inside out, how we look at the world, and how our act of looking at the world and thinking about it are part of our self-understanding, circle back into that understanding. And so that knowledge, that self-understanding is not separable from the knowledge that we gain. There's a fancy jargon for this distinction, and this seems like the kind of group that might like some fancy jargon. That is nomothetic disciplines, those that seek general laws applicable across contexts, versus ideographic disciplines, the emphasis on the unique, particular instance, the individual idiosyncratic thing or person. For most of us, the sciences and the humanities describe this distinction well enough, even if it's a little loose. We do this thing that we call the humanities alone as scholars, but significantly we use the plural. And not just because of the plurality of disciplines that constitutes the category, but also because we do this work in communities, in groups, with shared purposes, under conditions where we do not insist on rigid conformity of belief or uniformity of values. Hence our title, and a governing question each lecture will answer in its own way. What are the means, methods, and motivations by which we endeavor to make sense of ourselves? And I will just say as an overview, you know, the five speakers that you're going to be introduced to, I mean, they are an incredible group. If you haven't looked at their CVs yet, go do it if you want to be inspired. 3 of the 5 are former winners of the President's Distinguished Achievement Award. One of the up-and-comers, Kwan Ha, young faculty in English, publishes articles by the bucketful. He's unbelievable. And you're really going to be inspired by the quality and substance of these people. While there are distinctly human forms, and I'm going to, so you can see the, why is that not working? There's Anya, we'll come back to her in a second. There we go, Benedict. While there are distinctly human forms of exploring the human, next week we're going to think together about the role animals play in our attempt to make sense of the human. Benedict Boisseron is our speaker, and Benedict went to the University of Michigan. We overlap there. One of the things I want to say is I'm friends with all of these speakers, and they're great people. She lights up a room, Benedict. We didn't know each other at Michigan, but we knew all the same people, so we must have gone to a party together or something. You know? She's going to help us navigate the tense and uneven border between the human and the animal, between the self and the other, and the way that plays into the distinctive, bizarre, and pernicious effects of racism on the way we think about other humans. Her work teaches us to think about the way the discourse of slavery consistently links slaves with dogs in the cultural imagination, and by doing so, elevates dogs while placing radical limits on the humanity of the black body. Some research in the humanities Some research on the humanities focuses on really big questions that evolve slowly over time, reflecting in cultural practice different underlying concepts of big ideas. And David Sherman, who's here tonight, and by the way, who has an incredible head fake, you do not want to make the mistake of challenging him to a one-on-one basketball game. Bring your A game, David can play. He's a professor of philosophy, has one of those concepts in mind when he asks the questions, how can we define justice when it consists of many conflicting elements and our conception of it seems to change over time? We don't need to look far for the applied scenarios in which conflicts in our sense of what justice is lead to community and political conflicts of a high order. MLK's famous phrase, the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends toward justice, is a salient reminder that we might believe justice has an abstract disembodied source in a moral universe, but we might need to place our bodies on the line from time to time if we want to see that arc intersect with specific instances. We need to make sense of justice, in other words, both as individuals and as communities, in order to know what kinds of actions we need to take to bring justice to fruition. Kwan Ha's lecture will come at the question of making sense of ourselves through the collective cultural trauma that is war, specifically the Vietnam War, which left shattered bodies and minds on both sides of the Pacific. Kwan's work opens up the eyes of American readers to a distinctive perspective on the war through the Vietnamese who immigrated to America, who survived that war but returned to it repeatedly in much the same way that American culture does. Reading Kwan's work has attuned me to the way the Vietnam War serves as a trope in our self-understanding as a country, impacting our international politics as well as basic political questions, how we treat veterans, for example. But Kwan's work also gets us thinking about the myopia of our view of that war, in which we had Vietnamese allies whose children and grandchildren are now fully integrated Americans. What sense do they make of this foreign war? And lastly, Jillian Campana from the School of Theater and Dance will be talking about a core human ability, empathy, that we cultivate in our interactions with other people. Humans evolved empathy because we evolved in groups. Pushed and pulled by the minds, desires, and ideas of other people, we needed the ability to judge the intention of others, shape those intentions in relationship to our own desires, and work productively with others. I didn't actually get to her slide, sorry. There she is. Empathy is thus foundational to how we make sense of ourselves, and we can exercise it like a muscle through our active engagement with literature, music, art, and drama. Jillian is going to share her experience in honing the impulse to take the perspective of other human beings, a tool that actors have used for centuries, but that has a potent use in our daily lives as we make sense of ourselves through others. And on the last week, we'll gather our lecturers together for a panel on the future of the humanities. I hope you'll bring your questions, your insights, your opinions, your reflections, and your passion for the shared intellectual endeavor that we'll experience together in the next 6 weeks. So finally, for tonight, we turn to Anya Jabour, which I won't be able to get back to that slide, but it's okay. You're about to see her. Our acclaimed University of Montana professor of history, fresh from the recent PR glow hovering over her involvement in the excellent new PBS miniseries, Mercy Street. How many of you have seen that, by the way? Oh, good. It's so good, isn't it? Oh, it's really great. And you can really see her work in that show. You know how meticulous the history is there on Mercy Street, and some of you know that the invitation to participate as a historical consultant was based on her impressive publication record. 3 books on marriage and family in the post-Civil War and Civil War era, prominently Scarlet Sisters, young women in the Old South, as well as numerous articles. And in 2014, she won the Presidential Faculty Award for Distinguished Accomplishment. Tonight, we get to hear from her about recent work she's doing constructing a biography of a fascinating woman. And Sophonosiba, is it Isba or Isba? Isba? Yeah. Yeah, I love that name. I mean, I want to live in a world in which people can still be named Sophonosiba. Preston Breckenridge, an intellectual of the late 19th and early 20th centuries who grew up in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. Anya shares with us the painstaking research process of tracking down the sources of a human life, including the places that shaped her identity, but also, fortuitously, a treasure trove of papers from the Library of Congress, from which we hear her distinctive voice. With copious quotes from Breckenridge's memoirs, Anya's talk brings us into close contact with the human story of meaning-making, conditioned by the local historical events of her time, the Civil War, the emerging activism of women for their rights, but also touched by those trans-temporal moral and ethical dilemmas with which we still grapple. A child's choice to give her savings to poor children in China, a child's observation of her father giving money to a Confederate vet strung out on opiates. The year could be 2016. Please help me in welcoming Anya Jabour.
Thanks, Ashley. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Historians are not known for our technological expertise. Nonetheless, a very good friend of mine and fellow biographer suggested that it was very important that I have pretty pictures for people to look at. So, Nancy, hopefully you will approve. So I'm really honored and grateful this evening to have the opportunity to share some research that I've been engaged in for the past several years. A study of the educator and activist Sophonosiba Preston Breckenridge. Fortunately, you will not have to hear that entire name again. So I did not set out to write a biography of Breckenridge. I have a long-standing interest in exploring personal lives in historical context. My first book was a case study of a married couple. My second and third books included cameos of individuals, and I published numerous articles featuring case studies of individuals, families, and circles of friends. Nonetheless, when I discovered Breckenridge, it was by chance. In 2009, in the course of conducting background research for a planned book project on women teachers in the Victorian South, I came across a short biographical profile of Breckenridge. I was immediately intrigued to learn that despite earning her bachelor's degree in classics in 1888, her master's degree in political science in 1897, her PhD in political economy in 1901, and finally, her Juris Doctorate in, obviously, law in 1904, she was unable to find an academic position in any of her fields of specialty. As I continued reading about Breckenridge, I was further impressed to find that she responded to the limited professional opportunities available to women in early 20th century America by pioneering a new, female-friendly profession: social work. This discovery then prompted me to re-examine my assumptions about so-called feminized occupations, especially when I learned that in 1905, Breckenridge taught what was arguably the first women's studies class in the United States, and she did this in a Department of Household Administration. Who was this woman who persisted despite gender discrimination and transformed gender ghettos into feminist strongholds? How then did she use her position as a professor of social work to lobby for social reform and public policy? Breckenridge's background as well as her accomplishments interested me. How had this privileged daughter of one of the leading families of the Southern Confederacy come to be an outspoken advocate for African Americans, immigrants, and the working class? My curiosity was piqued. I wanted to know more about this remarkable woman, but I found myself frustrated by a lack of scholarship about her. I discovered that despite her long association with progressive reform and feminist activism, books on these subjects routinely omitted her, or if they did include her, they misspelled her name, which granted is easy to do. In addition, I discovered that while Breckenridge reached the height of her influence in the 1920s and 1930s, extant treatments of her career, like studies of progressivism and feminism more generally, concluded in 1920. At this point, my research began in earnest. Wondering if a lack of source material accounted for this neglect, I investigated further. To my delight, I discovered that the Library of Congress held a 37-reel set of microfilm papers, representing 39 boxes of manuscript material, which were available, the microfilm, via interlibrary loan. I immediately ordered the first 4 reels, the maximum permissible quantity, and eagerly awaited their arrival. What might I find in the approximately 14,000 items included in the Sophonosiba P. Breckenridge papers? When my order at last arrived, I wasted no time in taking my precious reels of microfilm and my laptop computer to the little-used microfilm readers located in the basement of the University of Montana's Mansfield Library. I was not disappointed. Indeed, I soon realized that Breckenridge's papers were a treasure trove of information about women's activism in modern America. Breckenridge was involved in virtually every reform of the Progressive and New Deal eras, including legal aid for immigrants, civil rights for blacks, labor legislation for workers, equal rights for women, and juvenile courts for youth. A tireless advocate for the nation's dispossessed, Breckenridge pressured local, state, and federal officials to fund programs and pass legislation to benefit the poor, the elderly, and the disabled. Her research was the basis for many of the labor laws and welfare programs we have today. Moreover, Breckenridge's influence extended beyond national boundaries. A co-founder of the U.S. chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Breckenridge called on European governments to establish an international community, uphold national self-determination, enforce international law, defend human rights, and ensure lasting peace. A set of goals that informed both the League of Nations and the United Nations. As the first American woman to represent the U.S. at an international diplomatic conference in 1933, she promoted the Good Neighbor policy, which established a new framework for U.S.-Latin American relations. Finally, as a participant in both European and Latin American social welfare organizations, she advanced international human rights. Many of the goals she advocated were articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the United Nations very fittingly adopted in 1948, the year of Breckenridge's death. As I came to understand that Breckenridge's life story could serve as a microcosm of the history of women's activism in modern America, I became committed to writing that story, to using one woman's life as an entry point into an entire world of women's social justice activism. But first, of course, I needed to know more about her. Fortunately, the more I learned about Breckenridge's life, the more leads I found to track down. I spent weeks examining both official records and personal papers held at the University of Chicago, where Breckenridge studied and taught for close to 50 years, as well as at Chicago's most famous settlement house, Hull House, where she spent all of her vacation quarters. I discovered a collection of oral histories with early social workers and traveled to Columbia University in New York City to read the reminiscences of her former students. I went to Lincoln, Nebraska, to examine the papers of Breckenridge's closest companion, Edith Abbott. I spent time in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to find examples of Breckenridge's classroom material held at the Social Welfare History Archives. In Washington, D.C., I visited the Library of Congress in person to find materials omitted from the microfilm edition of Breckenridge's papers, as well as to read her correspondence with such social reform leaders as African-American advocate Booker T. Washington, Red Cross founder Clara Barton, and suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt. I also spent time at the National Archives to read confidential materials in federal agency files. I immersed myself in Breckenridge's world. In Chicago, I spent hours roaming the University of Chicago campus, exploring Green Hall, the graduate women's residence she presided over for more than 40 years, and Cobb Hall, where she studied and worked for more than 50 years. I made repeated visits to the Hull House Museum, where the original house and dining hall, although not, unfortunately, the third floor where Breckenridge had her living quarters, are preserved and open to the public. My mother has made me a t-shirt with this image that says, "This is what historians do for fun." In Kentucky, I made a pilgrimage to Breckenridge's grave in the Lexington Cemetery and contemplated her tombstone, designed by life partner Edith Abbott, which, although you cannot see this in this particular photo, described her simply as a scholar, teacher, and humanitarian. In order to keep track of Breckenridge's many activities, I created a timeline on sheets of butcher paper affixed to my study wall. To organize copies of her voluminous correspondence, reams of memoranda, and draft publications, I began a growing collection of 3-ring binders. Some of you have been privileged to see these, organized by date and topic. To find space for all the material I was collecting, I had to build additional bookcases and reorganize my study. I soon had an entire room dedicated to Breckenridge. Of all the research material I gathered, however, one of the most intriguing sources is an unfinished manuscript, and I want to devote the rest of my time this evening to this item. When she was in her 80s, after retiring from the University of Chicago, Breckenridge began to write her memoirs. Although she published extensively in her lifetime, Breckenridge apparently did not finish her memoirs before her death. The extant memoirs consist of an assortment of fragmentary reminiscences, some typed, some handwritten, most unnumbered and out of order, and all much amended, on approximately 150 sheets of paper, a mix of bond and yellow-lined pages. Although the manuscript is not in order, Breckenridge wrote several different versions of the table of contents for her autobiography, making it possible to arrange the disordered pages of various drafts according to her original plan, or at least one of her original plans. I therefore was able to reconstruct the chapters on her ancestry, family, childhood, education, and early career. The manuscript ends in 1905 when she was 39 years old and just beginning her rise to national and international recognition as a scholar and social reformer. Fortunately, other records document the remainder of Breckenridge's life. My challenges in writing her biography result from an overabundance of source material rather than a shortage of information. Nonetheless, the unfinished autobiography offers unique insights into Breckenridge's sense of self. Indeed, the multiple drafts and extensive edits provide clues to both how Breckenridge thought about herself and how she wished to present herself to the world. Because Breckenridge approached this writing project in her characteristic fashion, double-checking details and correcting minor errors, it is factually accurate. But like all memoirs, it is a selective account, and the materials that Breckenridge chose to include and exclude, as well as how she chose to present those materials, are revealing. Just as I did not originally set out to write a biography of Breckenridge, Breckenridge did not initially set out to write her autobiography. Rather, she intended to pen a biography of her father, the Confederate veteran and Democratic Congressman W.C.P. Breckenridge. Yet despite years of research resulting in the accumulation of file after file of information about her father and other famous male ancestors, she found herself unable to write the volume she intended. Instead, she wrote about herself. In doing so, despite nagging self-doubt and reflexive self-criticism, she scribed her own story and inscribed herself into history. In her final writing project, Breckenridge attempted to impose order on her memories and to take stock of her long life. She sought to make meaning out of her memories, just as I am trying to fashion a narrative from the sources she left behind. In one version of the introduction, Breckenridge wrote, "What I hope to do in the following pages is to review my own life, which is now extended beyond the 40 milestone." Breckenridge's review of her own life represents a genre of women's autobiography that allows future scholars, like myself, to examine women's experiences and perspectives. Breckenridge's unfinished narrative also prefigures contemporary feminist biography in interesting ways. She contemplated, but ultimately rejected, writing yet another story about a great white man, instead choosing to write her own story. She placed her individual experience in historical context, and she insisted on calling attention to the interconnectedness of the personal and the political. Breckenridge's account also exhibits some of the hallmarks of women's memoirs, including a tendency to downplay her own achievements and to make invidious comparisons between herself and others. While these are common features of women's autobiographies, they also reflect her own early childhood experiences, which she describes with a rather wistful tone. Despite growing up surrounded by both family members and extended kin, Breckenridge depicts herself as isolated and lonely, neglected by her mother, abused by her grandmother, and alienated from her siblings. Breckenridge was, she said, saved by her father, who nurtured his bookish daughter's intellect and served as her primary caretaker. In her memoirs, like many other future reformers and professionals of her generation, Breckenridge calls attention to her father's close involvement in her upbringing and attributes her ambitions to his influence. W.C.P. Breckenridge missed the birth of his first child, Ella, while he was serving in the Confederate Army. But after returning home to Lexington, Kentucky, he embraced his second-born, born in 1866, as his own. Dubbing her his peace baby, he explained, "You were my baby from the hour of your birth. I put you to sleep. I walked you when you were sick." For her part, Breckenridge reveled in her father's love and attention. As she recalled, "I was a common child and a dull child. Not exactly stupid, but dull. So that it was thought that I would miss the point of all the jokes made the day before I died. But some of them thought that perhaps St. Peter did not have much of a sense of humor either, and perhaps he would go over there with me to make me feel quite at home. Two things saved me, in a way. I loved my father and wanted to please him." Despite a number of false starts and personal difficulties, ultimately Breckenridge's love and admiration for her father, together with his affection and encouragement for her, helped catapult her to prominence as one of the most well-known activists in 20th century America. Although she eventually decided to write her own story rather than her father's then, Breckenridge paid homage to her beloved father when she chose to craft her story as the evolution of a Southern feminist in the Progressive era. While Breckenridge's relationship with her father may have prompted her to follow in his footsteps by pursuing a career in public service, her mother's example also had a profound effect on her life course. Married at 17, Issa Breckenridge gave birth to 7 children in rapid succession, losing 2 children to infant maladies and permanently damaging her own health. Issa's nonstop childbearing, chronic health problems, and early death may well have led Breckenridge to reject marriage and motherhood at an early age. As she repeatedly pointed out in her memoirs, family life was hazardous to women's health. There was no doctrine of birth control or spaced childbearing prevalent at that time. My mother was very frail. I was only 15 months old when Deshay was born, and he was only 15 months old when Campbell came. And then, after the same interval, little Issa. There were babies and babies to come. Awareness of her parents' marital difficulties probably also contributed to Breckenridge's resolution to remain single for life. Breckenridge's mother indeed offered a vivid reminder of the drawbacks of woman's sphere and domestic life. Not only did Issa Breckenridge die young, but she also lived with the knowledge that her husband had carried on a long-term affair with a much younger woman, conceiving a child with his mistress while his wife lay on her deathbed. Thus, it is not surprising that Breckenridge's memoirs suggest that she never seriously considered marriage. Rather than depicting her coming of age as a Southern belle then, when Breckenridge looked back on her early life, she chose to highlight experiences that predisposed her toward a life of social activism. An encounter with a Chinese missionary, for instance, inspired a lifelong concern with international relations. As she explained, when we began to go to school, we got reports. We were given marks, 100, 99, 98, etc. Papa said that we could have either a dollar or a little party if we got perfect reports. I generally took the dollar, while Ella took the party. I had quite a little sum saved when a lady who had been a missionary to China came to stay with us. She gave such an account of the poverty of the Chinese children that I gave her my savings. My mother never forgave her for taking my little savings, but she, the missionary, undoubtedly thought that I was fortunate to have such a channel for distributing the little fund. Breckenridge probably included this story in her autobiography because it so succinctly established her early interest in assisting the poor, and perhaps also because it hinted at both her devotion to the welfare of American immigrants and her participation in international welfare movements as an adult. Breckenridge soon had another lesson in helping the less fortunate and avoiding snap judgments. As she explained, one day, when I was quite a big girl, I was walking along with my father in downtown Lexington. As we went along, a forlorn-looking man crept up near my father, and I saw a bill, which I've always thought was a $5 bill, pass from his hand to that of the beggar, as I thought the stranger to be. I was surprised at my father's giving a beggar such a very large sum, and asked him how he happened to do this. And he gave me the following reason. This apparently down and out man was an ex-Confederate soldier. Clever and witty, and of good substantial family, he was one of the casualties of war, in that when he was seriously wounded and the pain seemed unendurable, he was given opiates, and became the victim of the morphine habit. There was in those days no psychiatric treatment, any more than any occupational provision. And he, like others, lived on the affectionate but inadequate and uncertain contributions of the older members of the company or regiment or unit to which they found it least humiliating to appeal. Breckenridge learned from this experience to consider each individual's circumstances rather than blaming the poor for their plight. The encounter also opened her eyes to the negative consequences of there being no psychiatric treatment and no occupational provision for people with physical or mental limitations. Both of these insights would inform her later work on behalf of the poor and the disabled. Nisba's childhood experiences predisposed her to a life of public service. Growing up in a border state, Kentucky, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War also fostered her commitment to pacifism. Breckenridge grew up hearing stories about her ancestors' political leadership and distinguished bloodlines. Many of these stories revolved around the secession crisis and what she called the bitter cleavages of opinion, characteristic of many families of the border states. On her mother's side, both the Currys and the Deshays were ardent advocates of the Confederate cause, but the Civil War had divided the Breckenridge clan. Nisba's grandfather, Robert Jefferson Breckenridge, was a Presbyterian minister and an outspoken anti-slavery advocate. Two of his sons served in the Union Army. Two others, including Nisba's father, joined the Confederate Army. It is difficult to imagine the family strains in the face of such varied and difficult problems, Breckenridge reflected in her autobiography. While many children of Confederate veterans grew up learning to revere the lost cause and its fallen soldiers, Breckenridge insisted that her father gracefully conceded the Confederacy's defeat and committed himself to what she called the building of a new nation. The documents Breckenridge herself collected about her father's political career tell a different story. W.C.P. Breckenridge achieved political success by playing on local whites' resentments over so-called radical Reconstruction, touting the South's right to self-rule, and aligning himself with the Redeemers, who reclaimed white Democrats' political dominance in the post-Reconstruction era. In her memoirs, however, Breckenridge glossed over her father's commitment to what he called, in a public speech, a white man's state, and instead highlighted the legacy of her anti-slavery ancestors. Rather than emphasizing her father's commitment to the lost cause of the Southern Confederacy and white supremacy, Breckenridge chose to focus on the ways in which her childhood awareness of war's destructiveness inspired her lifelong pacifism. Witnessing firsthand the resentment, confusion, hatred, domestic tragedy, deprivation, and distorted social relationships created by the Civil War, she recalled, convinced her early on of the futility of war. Although, like most Confederate children, she originally learned that the object of resentment and hatred was the enemy, she soon became convinced that not the enemy, but war itself is the source of wrong. Instead of defending states' rights, as so many Southern whites did, Breckenridge instead, as an adult, came to advocate what she called an indestructible union of indestructible states, dedicated to ensuring all countries, groups, and individuals full enjoyment of community rights and lasting peace. At the height of World War I, Breckenridge published an article in which she asserted that women had a special responsibility to ensure world peace. "Women want a piece of justice," she wrote, "a justice that means a fair chance for all, great and small, mighty and humble, to do their part, to live their life, and to make their contribution in a world fellowship." Despite vicious red baiting throughout her career, as hinted at here by one of many newspaper articles, Breckenridge never wavered in her pacifism, remaining an outspoken opponent of militarism throughout both world wars. Breckenridge's memoirs also suggest that her youthful experiences foreshadowed her future feminist commitments. Eager for his precocious daughter to continue her education, WCP convinced the trustees of Kentucky Agricultural and Mechanical College, A&M, now the University of Kentucky, to admit women. And at the age of 14, Breckenridge enrolled in 1880. Although A&M allowed women to attend classes, it by no means treated them as equals. Female students could only earn certificates, not diplomas, and there was significant resistance to their presence on campus. Although Breckenridge excelled in her coursework, which included English, mathematics, German, and geography, she did not obtain a degree from the future University of Kentucky. However, her experience at A&M made her a determined advocate for women's equality. While, as she explained, she had always cared a good deal about grades, she now had an additional reason to do well in her coursework, to prove women's intellectual capacity. "I cared about good grades because it pleased my father to have me make good grades, and justified his position with reference to the treatment of women," she explained. But her account of her competition with the men in her class for top grades, and even more, her account of an altercation with a mathematics professor who did not like girls in his class, indicated that she also had something to prove. In her memoirs, she related, with relish, an occasion on which she turned the tables on the sexist instructor. "At the University of Kentucky, I had an instructor who did not like girls in his class. And one day, he gave me a really difficult problem, which I could not solve. That night, in my sleep, it came to me, but I said nothing to him. I thought that he would try again to humiliate me, and that was a day when the trustees were likely to drop in. Sure enough, the committee of trustees dropped in, and sure enough, he gave me the unsolved problem of the day before. I was so pleased that I probably looked a little triumphant, and put my problem on the board and then explained to the visitors about the equation. I was maliciously complacent, and he was really quite upset. He knew that nobody could have helped me, and at last he said, 'How did you do it?' And I said, politely, 'I suppose I knew that you thought I couldn't do it, and so would give it to me. At any rate, it came to me in my sleep. I am glad you gave me another chance.'" Dissatisfied with her experience at A&M, in 1884, Breckenridge convinced her parents to allow her to move north to attend Wellesley College. With an all-female faculty and student body, Wellesley was not only a training ground for feminist activists, but also one of the few colleges to admit African American students. Breckenridge's experiences there not only furthered her commitment to feminism, but also challenged her views on race. In her memoirs, Breckenridge chose to depict her father as a racial liberal. As Breckenridge liked to point out, W.C. Breckenridge was always for fair play. He supported public schools for African Americans, and he espoused blacks' right to give testimony against whites. But as Breckenridge well knew from research into her father's career, WCP also helped to ensure the disfranchisement of African Americans in Kentucky, and he defended Klansmen accused of brutalizing local blacks. In both the newspaper clippings she saved and the memoirs she wrote, however, Breckenridge emphasized the ways in which her father supported African American rights, rather than the ways in which he upheld white supremacy. Breckenridge selectively included information about her father's record on race to cast him in a favorable light. She also scrupulously avoided discussing local race relations in her autobiography. Given the racial tensions that characterized the South during Breckenridge's childhood and adolescence, this is a telling omission. By contrast, Breckenridge's older sister Ella devoted significant attention to the family's African American servants in her own memoirs. Ella's comments make it clear that the Breckenridge family, like many others in post-Civil War South, adhered to a code of racial etiquette that upheld white supremacy. For instance, white parents trained their offspring to display their own racial superiority and reinforce black servility by referring to adult African Americans by their given names rather than by a title and surname, while at the same time requiring blacks to use titles when referring or speaking to whites of any age. This pattern is clear in Ella's reminiscences. Breckenridge also displayed this linguistic hierarchy in fragmentary, handwritten reminiscences about her family's black servants. Reminiscences that she chose not to include in later typed versions of her autobiography. Instead, Breckenridge chose to highlight her time at Wellesley College, and especially her friendship with a fellow classics scholar, Ella Smith, as what she called the occasion of my working through the problem of racial relationships. As an adult, Breckenridge would become a civil rights advocate, holding membership in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and supporting Ida B. Wells Barnett's anti-lynching campaign. By the time she wrote her memoirs then, she sought to distance herself from her white supremacist upbringing. In those memoirs, she explained, "On that first day when my father and mother and I arrived, as we approached the entrance of Wellesley, a handsomely dressed couple of the Negro race, with an attractive daughter, approached the door. Mrs. Stone, a neighbor, asked my father, 'Will you let Nisba go to school with a Negro?' To which my father replied, 'She got on all right with the boys at A&M. I think that she will get on all right with the colored.'" Breckenridge continued, "I cannot say that settled everything. For a little later, when the singers from Fisk University came, and some were placed at our table, at that time we served each other. I found no difficulty in serving them, but my own food I could not swallow." Later in junior year, the question was raised again. Ella Smith's right to have the same number of invitations to our junior promenade as her white classmates was raised. Some argued that she could claim equality in educational matters, but not in social matters. But I insisted, and with Miss Alice Freeman's help, successfully, that every experience at Wellesley was educational. After graduating from Wellesley College in 1888, Breckenridge returned to the family home. Like many other college-educated women of her generation, she faced a severe and prolonged crisis after graduation, repeatedly putting her own goals on hold in order to fulfill family obligations. In addition, Breckenridge's postgraduate years were marred by her mother's early death, her father's scandalous sexual misbehavior, and her stepmother's mental illness. She taught school, traveled in Europe, kept house, and struggled with poor health and poorer spirits. In her memoirs, Breckenridge compressed her post-collegiate years, reducing nearly 7 years of struggle to a few sentences. "It is blurred in my memory now," she recalled from the vantage point of the 1940s, but those first years of the 1890s were hard years. My own life during the years after Wellesley was a confused life. Initially, Breckenridge accompanied her parents to Washington, D.C., where she taught mathematics and her father attended Congress. Although Breckenridge was a successful and popular school teacher, her life in Washington, D.C. fell far short of her ambitions. As she explained, after graduating from Wellesley in 1888, I had expected to study law. But at that time, there were not many law schools open to women. My mother's health was frail and the family expenses were high. The only law school open to women in Washington had classes in the evening, and that was when I could be of service at home. Like many other new women of her generation, Breckenridge was hemmed in by conventional gender roles in a variety of ways. Despite her opportunities for higher education, after college, Breckenridge found herself living with her family, helping with housework, and contributing her pay to the household coffers. When the school year began, she recalled, I found myself teaching algebra, geometry, and trigonometry. I was appointed to mathematics faculty of the Washington High School, where I taught during the years 1888 to 89 and 1889 to 90. The salary was certainly a real contribution to the family income, and I greatly enjoyed my first earnings, which I gave to Mama. Besides the teaching, I did a good deal of housekeeping. In her memoirs, however, Breckenridge chose to highlight the constraints placed upon women in Gilded Age America with a humorous anecdote about a disagreement with her brother, Deshay. At the time, the family lived a significant distance from the school where Breckenridge taught, and she formed a plan to learn to ride the bicycle, a new activity for women at the time. As she explained the resulting exchange with her brother, when women first rode bicycles, I was teaching in the Washington High School. I took a few lessons, perhaps only one, when he said that it was hard enough to have a sister earn her living, and it was too much to have her ride a bicycle. I've never learned either to ride a bicycle or drive a car. Breckenridge's teaching career was brief. For only 2 years after graduation, she fell prey to a devastating influenza epidemic. Alarmed by her continued poor health, the Breckenridges sent her and her younger sister, Curry, to Europe to recover their health and to continue their studies, languages for Curry and law for Breckenridge. However, the sisters' studies were cut short by news of their mother's illness. Hastily boarding a steamer, they returned home only to find that Issa had already died. Once again, Breckenridge took over domestic responsibilities, keeping house for her widowed father and tutoring Curry at home. Her father's decision to remarry less than a year later only increased her difficulties. Almost immediately, another woman, Madeline Pollard, filed suit in a Washington, D.C. court for breach of promise, claiming that WCP had reneged on his promise to marry her. She further averred that she and the defendant had engaged in a lengthy extramarital affair that began shortly after their first meeting on April 1st, 1884, which happened to be Breckenridge's birthday during her first year at Wellesley, and that the affair continued into 1893, that is, during and after Issa's final illness, testifying that the affair had resulted in the birth of 2 children, one in 1885 and another in 1888. She also presented evidence that the affair continued throughout WCP's term in office. Pollard followed him to Washington, D.C., where he finagled a government job for her. After conceiving a third time, shortly after Issa's death, Pollard secured a promise of marriage only to miscarry, and then to learn that her lover had married another woman. The ensuing trial was highly publicized and disastrous for everyone involved. The scandal ended WCP's political career. The newest Mrs. Breckenridge had a nervous breakdown, and Sophonosiba Breckenridge herself sank deeply into depression. As she put it in her memoirs, the question of my health and my future became acute. Fortunately for Breckenridge, when her concerned father sent his dispirited daughter to Chicago to visit a former Wellesley classmate, a chance meeting with Marion Talbot, Dean of Women at the new coeducational University of Chicago changed her life course. I cannot quite remember how things happened, Breckenridge later reflected, but this meeting proved to be a turning point in her life. Talbot encouraged Breckenridge to enter graduate study at the University of Chicago and gave her a part-time job to cover her living expenses. In her memoirs, Breckenridge wrote, "First of all, I want to acknowledge the heavy obligation under which I lie to Miss Talbot, Marion Talbot. I owe her all I am." Breckenridge reveled in her coursework at the Coeducational Research University, even as she reflected on the particular challenges she encountered there. That year, 1894-95, that I spent in Chicago, I spent mostly in room 309, Cobb Hall. I got the janitor to shorten the front legs of one of the big chairs, otherwise my feet would not touch the ground. After what she called a glorious year of studying political science with the renowned legal scholar Ernst Freund, Breckenridge was out of funds. She returned home to write her master's thesis on the early legal system in her home state of Kentucky, where she also at last achieved her long-standing goal of qualifying to practice law. As she explained, "I spent a good deal of time in my father's office. Many young lawyers had come to the bar by way of reading law in his office, and when I began going down with him, it was not Blackstone he suggested my reading, but Adams on equity. One day, when Deshay was going to Frankfurt, I decided to go along and asked the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals, who had been a messmate of my father's during the Civil War, to let me try an examination. He assembled 2 other justices, and we sat in one of their chambers in the beautiful old court building. I don't know whether or not they were especially careful in the selection of their questions, but after a few 3 hours or 4, they agreed that I was qualified to practice, and right there administered the oath required of members of the bar, including the pledge that I had never fought a duel with deadly weapons." Newspapers had a field day with that. The following Monday, I was presented to the court in Lexington. However, Breckenridge had evidently lost her zeal for practicing law alongside her father. As she explained, during the first week, 3 cases involving women's special interests were brought me. But when Miss Talbot snatched for me a fellowship in political science, which a man student had resigned, I came back to the university and have remained ever since. Since my return to the university in 1898, I have never left without either a round-trip ticket or an arrangement that ensured my return. Indeed, Breckenridge spent the remainder of her life in Chicago, where she earned advanced degrees in political science, political economy, and law, joined the community of women reformers at Hull House, and established the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, the nation's first graduate-level social work program to be affiliated with a research university. Breckenridge never forgot the debt she owed to Talbot, who launched her teaching career by giving her the opportunity to teach at the University of Chicago in 1905. That class I mentioned earlier, the Women's Studies class in the Department of Household Administration. It's called the Legal and Economic Status of Women. But while she remained close to her mentor, Breckenridge spent most of her adult life with another woman, Edith Abbott, a former school teacher and brilliant statistician, who came to the University of Chicago to study economics in 1903. Recalling an incident that would prove to be a turning point in both women's lives, Breckenridge wrote in her memoirs about her 1905 course, "Among the students who took the course on women was Edith Abbott. I shall never forget the fright she caused me when I said something about the way in which women had carried the work of the world, while men were doing the fighting and hunting. 'Do you mean to say?' she asked. 'I thought I did,' I replied. 'I must look into that,' she replied. And her looking into that resulted in her first publication, Women in Industry, a pioneering study of women's wage work. For the next 4 decades, Abbott and Breckenridge, known as A and B, on the University of Chicago campus, shared both their daily lives and their life work. Reflecting on their relationship in 1948, one mutual acquaintance wrote, your beautiful, devoted friendship shines with a rare light, showing us what women who share in life and work can mean to the world. Breckenridge and Abbott's personal relationship fostered both their professional success as leaders of the School of Social Service Administration and their political effectiveness as advisors to local, state, and federal policymakers. Breckenridge's extant autobiography concludes in 1905. Even though she never completed or published her memoirs, Breckenridge considered her life important enough to create a lasting record of her lifelong commitment to progressive reform. Her autobiography provides the basis for a feminist biography that highlights the connections between the personal and the political. When combined with a wealth of other primary sources, including personal correspondence, professional publications, government publications, and organizational records, among others, Breckenridge's unfinished memoir provides the basis for a biography that addresses both Breckenridge's political achievements and her personal motivations. In my forthcoming book, the first full-length biography of Breckenridge, I hope to provide both an engaging story about one woman's life and a fresh interpretation of feminist activism in modern America. But there's more to it than that. Breckenridge was only one of many women of her generation who committed their lives to the pursuit of women's equality and social justice. As one commemorative plaque put it, these women, bearing torches, passed them from hand to hand. Breckenridge's life story challenges all of us to take up the torch and carry on this legacy. Thank you.
Okay, as usual, we have some time for questions here. And I think Molly and Angela will have the microphones, and if you'll just put up your hand so that we can see you, I'll try to point to you and Anya will answer your question from here. Okay, so questions. Anybody? Put up a hand.
Oh, right in the middle. Ken. Impossible to reach.
Please wait.
I can yell.
It's coming from behind you, Ken.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, Anya. I'm inspired. Can you talk about the audiences she was imagining for her memoir? It's just interesting the way she was shaping the past. She must have had audiences in mind, and I'm kind of curious about who they might have been.
That is a fascinating question, in part because she specified that she did not want any of her papers to be preserved, including the autobiography. So she collected the papers of all of her family members, mostly but not only, the various illustrious men from her family line. She donated all of them to the Library of Congress with the express intention that they would be used to write a biography of her father, which never happened, incidentally. Well, it did, but not until the 1980s. But she expressly requested that her own papers not be donated but be destroyed. And it was her partner, Edith Abbott, who insisted on keeping her papers and who was responsible for donating them to the Library of Congress. So, I mean, was this just an exercise that she was engaging in order to sort of make sense of her own life and figure out what she was doing? It seems like it had to have been something more than that, or she would not have written successive drafts, had them typed, corrected them, left little spaces, and when she couldn't remember a name or a date, and then would have a little marginal note saying, check on this, or look this up, or a picture of her could go here. I mean, right? I mean, it really seems like she was planning on publishing this. And indeed, she had earlier written a biography of her sister-in-law, her brother Deshay's wife, Madeline Breckenridge, who was herself a progressive reformer, although at a more local level. She was a very well-known reformer in Kentucky, sort of at the same time. She died very young. She died, I think, in 1920. And Breckenridge had written a biography of Madge, so maybe she had in mind something along those lines. but it's really not quite clear from what's left behind. As I say, that it seems like on the one hand she had this desire to acknowledge the importance of her work, and on the other hand she was a deeply self-effacing person who had a very hard time accepting compliments about her accomplishments, and so I could well imagine I mean, in fact, that's one of my theories for why she stops in 1905, right? That once her story gets to the point where she can't lay all of her achievements at somebody else's doorstep, you know, my dad did this for me, Miss Talbot did this for me, etc. Once she would actually have to take credit for what she did, she runs out of steam. Or maybe it was just that she was in poor health, which she was. But I tend to think that she also had some kind of deep-seated reluctance to actually, you know, toot her own horn. So that's what I can say. I don't know.
Should ask him to go do some research and go home and write a paper.
That's what I do for my students.
That's right. Another question. Any place. Right down here, Molly has it, I think. Molly?
Look that way, Anya.
Hi, Anya. Can you talk a little bit about the process of trying to figure out where those kinds of shifts in perspective that she was making in her memoir occurred, you know, where she was remembering her past differently from the facts that you have? Was that the result of research you had done prior to getting to the memoir, or did you find spots there that you said, this doesn't ring right, and went back and looked at them?
Both. So I read all of the papers at the Library of Congress before I read the autobiography, right? So I had already read the single largest collection of her writings. That collection of her writings happened to be kind of light on the years before 1920, and of course the memoirs only go up to 1905, so they didn't really match each other in that way, right? In other words, I couldn't tell from the Library of Congress, then reading her memoir, kind of what was missing. So the part about figuring out what was missing really came from other things, like when I went to Kentucky and I found her sister Ella's memoirs, and her sister Ella's memoirs are fascinating because they are so different. So Ella has nothing but good things to say about their grandmother. And I didn't include these passages, but I mean, Breckenridge's descriptions of her grandmother are horrific. I mean, her grandmother was very stern, she was autocratic, she was racist, she was classist, she said awful things about the Breckenridge girls. She said that she evaluated a lady based on how she made a buttonhole, and that the Breckenridge girls were terrible at working buttonholes. So they were failures, right, as elite women. And she was very physically abusive as well as emotionally abusive to Sophonosiba. Ella, on the other hand, you know, thinks that her grandmother was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and talks about her reading the bedtime stories. You know, I'm like, okay, who is this person? And then Ella also goes on and on and on and on about these black servants in the Breckenridge household who I knew were there. I knew they existed because of the census data, but Breckenridge said nothing about them in the autobiography proper. And then in a collection of miscellaneous materials in a different collection, not the same collection as the autobiography, a different collection, I found a half-page, handwritten, never completed passage where Breckenridge talked about the black servants that she had grown up with. And then that's separate from the rest of the memoirs, and it's not, she never repeats that story. I mean, there are some stories that she repeats over and over and over again, like the man who begged. It comes up over and over and over again. There's several different versions of that story. The description of her family servants, once, handwritten, never finished, and never again, even though there's at least, I mean, they're all fragments, but at least 5 or 6 different versions of the autobiography. So it was kind of a process of going back and forth, because I read the autobiography about a year in to the research, and then I read it again about 3 years into the research, and then I read it again just this last year and actually transcribed it completely. Actually transcribed every single word. And in the process of doing that, I found things in it that I hadn't noticed before, because it's really quite difficult to read. So I found things in there that I hadn't noticed before, and started doing things like keeping track of, oh, that's interesting. This is the 3rd time she said this story. Why did she say that one 3 times? And then this other one just, drops out entirely. And then other things are completely absent. She never once mentions that her father was personally responsible for enacting the capitation tax in Kentucky, which is like Kentucky's version of the poll tax. Never once, ever says that. That comes from something else entirely. But in one of those miscellaneous files, there's file after file after file of miscellany. In one of those miscellaneous files is an index of every time her father appeared in the local paper during those years, in the Weekly Dollar or something, and there are reports there that her father did this. And she collected those reports, had them typed out and indexed, right? So she knew. There's no question that this was like a faulty memory issue. She absolutely knew. She chose to leave it out. So it was kind of back and forth and back and forth. I would learn more about something from some other source, and then I would go back to the autobiography and say, is that there? And if so, how? And if not, why? And then that happened a lot, many times. I'm still doing that, actually.
Okay, Angela. Right behind you, the mic is coming.
Yeah, you mentioned her role in the League of Women Voters, but you didn't mention very much about political activism of any kind, the suffrage movements or other movements like that. Was she not involved in those? And if not, I wonder why.
She was involved in absolutely everything. Her life is like a checklist of women's progressive activism. So she was involved in the suffrage movement. She was involved in the anti-lynching movement. She was involved in the legal aid movement. She was involved in the juvenile court movement. She was involved in the anti-prostitution movement. They're pretty much the only social movement that she was not involved in that occurred during her lifetime was temperance and prohibition. Other than that, she did absolutely everything. But her memoirs, of course, stop before she gets to that point. So her memoirs are all sort of how she got to be that person who engaged in all that activism, but she doesn't actually get to any of the activism in the memoirs. But yeah, the bulk of the book is about her many-faceted political activism. She was also, one of the main things that she did that we tend not to think about, or at least until recently I tended not to think about, and since this is what I do, I assume that means that we tend not to think about it, is that she was really an architect of social welfare policy. So essentially the programs that she advocated beginning in 1910 ultimately would be incorporated into the Social Security Act and then to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1935 and 1938. And all of that whole set of social welfare programs remained intact until welfare reform, and some of them still do. But OSHA, yeah, she did that like 50 years earlier. Everything. There's pretty much nothing you can point to and not like see her fingers in it somewhere.
Another question. Way in the back, Angela. To the right.
I thank you for your I don't call it lecture. I guess that's what we call it in a place like this, but I wonder if high school students in Kentucky
Mm-hmm.
know of her, whether her work and her name even is
Mhm.
one that's familiar and honored, or whether or not.
That is a great question. I don't know if high school students know about her, and I will have to look into that. There is an entire room at the University Library at the University of Kentucky that's dedicated to the Breckenridge family. I mean, everyone's heard the Breckenridge name. Whether or not they associate the Breckenridge name with her, as opposed to, I mean, usually it's her father that people have in mind. I'm not sure, right? But I mean, everyone recognizes the Breckenridge name there. In fact, I mean, they're the ones who correct my pronunciation when I'm wrong. But those aren't high school students. I have yet to encounter any high school students. However, my best friend from graduate school has 2 kids in junior high, so perhaps by the time I finish the book, I can manage to, finagle my way into the high school system that way. We'll see.
So there's somebody right in the middle who could contribute something, right?
But I'm not in high school. But when I went, I'm from Kentucky, and when I went to high school, no, her name was never, ever brought up. Yes, the Breckenridge name was known, but
Yeah,
it'd
and
be great to know they're teaching that now.
yeah, it would be. I mean, I think she's better known in Chicago. The University of Chicago campus has a hall, Breckenridge Hall, and the students there are really aware of who she is. They have an annual day that they call Sophie Day, for Sophonosiba. So they celebrate Sophie Day. Breckenridge Hall was going to be closed and condemned and demolished, and they held a massive protest to demand that Breckenridge Hall be preserved. Her picture is very prominently displayed in both the law school. She was a member of the first graduating class at the University of Chicago, and of course it's very prominently displayed at the School of Social Service Administration. Those 2 buildings are side by side now. They didn't used to be. So the sort of her presence is a lot more obvious in Chicago, whereas, as I say, in Kentucky, it's more about the Breckenridges, but I haven't seen so much about her. However, perhaps I'll have an opportunity to remedy that. We shall see.
In the very back. Anya in the very back.
I have 2 questions, Anya. By the way, thank you very much. But also, is there anything in the papers that indicates what her father thought about the career she chose?
Good.
And the
question.
second question is, how will we know when your book is published?
Well, let me start with the question I can answer. So her father wrote a really interesting essay right before he died, or very shortly before he died, and he died the year she graduated from law school in 1904. And I can't remember if this was in 1903 or 1901, but it was very shortly before. And he writes this editorial in the newspaper that he edited, the Lexington Herald, and he says that the father of an exceptional daughter faces a difficult situation because he wants for her to fully realize her ambitions, and yet those ambitions do not fit the social norm. And then he kind of goes on about this and reflects on this and talks about how eventually he will come to he's talking about himself in the third person. Eventually he will come to a place where he realizes that just because she's a woman doesn't mean that she should have any less opportunity to fully realize her potential than anyone else. And so it's this kind of, lovely sort of meditation on his coming to terms with his daughter's career choices, which indicates a lot more ambivalence than she indicates in her memoirs, in which she depicts him as being, consistently and entirely supportive. So he was very supportive in certain ways. He always urged her to get an education. He told her from a very early age that he expected that she would have to support herself because he wasn't going to be able to. And by the time she started college, everyone in her family, without ever saying why, assumed she would not marry. They just kind of took it as read, and so they didn't explain themselves. And so he was very supportive in certain ways. He helped her get the job at Washington High School teaching mathematics. He made that connection for her in DC, where he had lots of connections. However, he refused to let her practice law in his law office until 1897, and she had hoped to do it as early as 1888, right? So there was a long period where she wanted to work in his law office and he wouldn't let her. Meanwhile, he took her brother, Deshay, into his office as kind of a junior partner, and Deshay had no interest at all in the law. I mean, none. That was not his interest even remotely. So he was inconsistent in his support. But I do think it's, she was obviously very close to him, and she was distraught when he died in 1904. But it's only after he died that she finally really cut her ties with Kentucky and did what she was going to do. And in fact, she gets this great letter from a college friend that says, "Now is your chance to take life with the open hand." And that was definitely definitely after Breckenridge, WCP had died. The book. Well, I'm on sabbatical next year, so that's promising that I will actually manage to deliver the manuscript to my publisher, which is the University of Illinois Press. They are currently looking at a 2018 or 19 publication date. The world of publishing is slow and uncertain, but that's the current estimate.
Excellent. Well, I think it's about 8:30, so Anya, would you take some questions if somebody people want to come up and ask for questions?
Sure,
at
of
the
course.
end, and if you have to leave, you may leave. Okay, thanks.